Good evening, everyone. So this is the story of an inspirational, bearded leader who is leading his people through the wilderness to ultimate salvation with the initials JC. But as I will show, so far as most of the British media are concerned, Jeremy Corbyn is not the Messiah. He's a very naughty boy. And this all stems, of course, from his time as chair of the Judean People's Front. The Stop the War Coalition, because Jeremy Corbyn committed that heresy in British politics of getting the Iraq war right. Now, of course, the savaging that he receives for that from the written press, often known as the Tory press, is to be expected. But what I shall concentrate on mainly this evening is to present some snippets of evidence that Jeremy Corbyn and his supporters would have at least an equal grievance with the coverage offered of such affairs by the BBC. Now, I'm concentrating on that for several reasons. One, because that's where I spent most of my own career in journalism. I finished up as a presenter on BBC World. And that acquainted me closely with a number of the BBC's ideological blind spots. It overlapped with the period in office of George W. Bush, whom we now realise, of course, was a towering intellect and beacon of moral rectitude as an occupant of the Oval Office. Just to give you an idea, it also saw the first election of the Iranian president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. You can tell I spent time with the BBC pronunciation unit on that one. Quite often when I was presenting, I would have the final say on the wording of the links the presenter would read, or the cues, as they're called in the BBC, which is out of consideration. If you're going to say these words, you ought to be able to write them to suit yourself. And quite often I would be given a script which referred to Iran's hardline president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And I would invariably take out the word hardline. And so after a few nights of this, one of the producers came over to me and said, "It's terribly pleased that you're giving your full attention to these cues, Jake. But tell me, the word hardline, what have you got against it?" So I said, "Well, just try this for size then. What have we told BBC audiences about the latest words and deeds of America's hardline president, George W. Bush?" And the bloke said, "Yeah, I see what you mean. Yes, quite, accepted the point." So that kind of ideological blind spot that's at work in a lot of BBC journalism, a kind of reflex or preemptive buckle, as it's called, to try to forestall what can be anticipated as vituperative criticism that would otherwise be visited upon the corporation. And that I think, has a substantial role to play in the picture that I will unfold this evening. Now, Jeremy Corbyn has broken with the elite consensus that has held sway in British politics for several decades now. Really, one can date it from the election of 1979, which brought Margaret Thatcher to office. It has several main dimensions, chiefly associated with economic policies, called monetarism at the time. Here in Australia, I think very similar policies went by the name of economic rationalism for a while, and they are commonly ascribed to the neoliberal policy set, that is, marketisation and privatisation and so forth. Jeremy Corbyn and his supporters, Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, at the last general election, for example, put forward policies which offered to break with that consensus to some extent, renationalising utilities that had been sold off to private buyers, for example. But his break from the establishment consensus is, I would suggest, equally notable for his analysis of security issues. A couple of years ago, I took part in a small part in an exercise which gathered together people from the British peace industry. That is not just universities, but also think tanks and NGOs. And we went on a retreat to a very agreeable centre in the southwest of England called the Amadown Centre. And the fruits of that exercise came out a year or two later in a report called Rethinking Security. And this report identified the chief elements of what it called the dominant security paradigm. And in the dominant security paradigm, Britain, and one could delete as applicable and insert the names of other countries, such as Australia, for example, but in this one, Britain is essentially a virtuous country which tootles along in the world, minding its own business, and then every so often it says, oh, fuck, there's a security threat. Where did that come from? And in this paradigm, this security threat has to be met with the use of force to neutralize it. And what is entirely missing from this narrative is any suggestion that the world we meet is one that is partly, at least, of our own making. That is to say, it disavows any role for Britain's past actions in creating these security threats in the first place. And Jeremy Corbyn has broken with that dominant security paradigm or narrative. So, for example, in the election campaign last year, campaigning was suspended for 24 hours in the wake of a calamitous terrorist attack on a pop concert in Manchester, which killed 21 people. And quite soon afterwards, a lot of leads pointed towards the provenance of the suicide bomber as having come out of the Libyan exiled community of South Manchester. So Jeremy Corbyn marked the resumption of campaigning with a speech in which he took on this issue directly. And let me just find you what he said. He emphasised the connections between wars our government has supported or fought in other countries, such as Libya, and terrorism here at home. He went on to say that drawing attention to such connections in no way reduces the guilt of the attacker, but protecting this country requires us to be both strong against terrorism and strong against the causes of terrorism. Which was neat, really, because it was a conscious echo of a phrase closely associated with Jeremy Corbyn's political anti-hero in the Labour pantheon, namely Tony Blair, who, when he was opposition leader and campaigning to enter number 10, made a great virtue of this as Shadow Home Secretary. This was before he became a leader, that he vowed that a Labour government would be tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. So it was a conscious echo of Blair's own phrase, which I think was rather neat. Now, for this intervention, Jeremy Corbyn was subjected to a scourging and a kind of tidal wave of scorn and belittlement from not only his enemies in the Tory media, but also government ministers who were kind of lined up in the broadcasting studios to denounce the heresy that Jeremy Corbyn had just uttered and say how ghastly and unpatriotic he was and so on and so forth. But it wasn't the first time that Jeremy Corbyn had voiced these connections or made what I will tentatively call the blowback thesis. The blowback thesis. Now, what do I mean by blowback? Well, blowback is a name which came into reasonably widespread circulation after the publication of a book which had that word as its title by somebody called Chalmers Johnson. And Chalmers Johnson was an international relations scholar, but had been for many years in the 60s and 70s an advisor to the CIA. And Johnson found that the word blowback was in common use within the agency, but it was studiously kept from the public. And he thought that was wrong because it was, after all, the public whose taxes were paying for the agency and its various activities. And just let me try and flick forward here, and I'll read you something that Johnson wrote about it. He writes, "The concept blowback doesn't just mean retaliation for things our government has done to and in foreign countries. It refers to retaliation for the numerous illegal operations we have carried out abroad that were kept totally secret from the American public." This is the crucial bit. "This means that when the retaliation comes, as it did so spectacularly on September the 11th, 2001, the American public is unable to put the events in context. So they tend to support acts intended to lash out against the perpetrators, thereby most commonly preparing the ground for yet another cycle of blowback." Now, if you cross-reference that with the famous, or indeed infamous, finding of opinion polls suggesting that by the time of the invasion of Iraq, as many as 2/3 of Americans believe that it was Saddam Hussein who was directly responsible for the 9/11 attacks, then you begin to perceive the connections, that the political collateral for the invasion of Iraq was derived precisely from this blowback effect and the fact that the American public had been kept in the dark about it. Indeed, I remember from the time a few brave souls did point out that if Saddam Hussein really did possess weapons of mass destruction, then we should know about it because, as Jesse Jackson put it to an interviewer, we have the receipts, he said. We have the receipts. And there was one photograph of the deal being done between Saddam Hussein and a representative of the United States government at the time, one Donald Rumsfeld, back in the late 1970s, when they were pictured shaking hands and grinning inanely at each other. And that picture appeared on just one program on US network television through that period. Was it NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw? No. Was it CBS Evening News with Dan Rather? No. It was the Oprah Winfrey Show. Good old Oprah. So this blowback syndrome is well established. And Jeremy Corbyn was drawing attention to a portion of it in his remarks on the Manchester bombing. But as I say, it wasn't the first time that he'd put this forward. On a previous occasion, Jeremy Corbyn had only recently been elected as Labour leader. He'd only been in office for a few months. At the time of the calamitous attack on the Bataclan nightclub and numerous other targets in Paris by Islamic State on November the 13th, 2015. Now, the weekend saw journalists scrambling to catch up with events and telling people the outlines of what had happened, the famous who, what, where, when, why, and how. So really, in a sense, the interesting period for us was the one that began on the following Monday. And on the following Monday, debate switched to how the UK and other countries should respond to this turn of events, and as always on such occasions, the notion that it should be a military response seemed to swarm unbidden and of its own accord right to the top of the agenda. And Jeremy Corbyn made an interesting intervention in Parliament in which he said, and bear with me while I find the quote because I think it's an interesting one, he said, it's vital at a time of such tragedy and outrage not to be drawn into responses which feed a cycle of violence and hatred. And he went on to say, President Obama has said that Islamic State grew out of our invasion of Iraq and is one of its unintended consequences. So there was Jeremy Corbyn on his feet in the House of Commons in his intervention in this debate, voicing the blowback thesis. So what I did in a little piece of research was to look at the extent to which that point was picked up in coverage of this affair and the issues arising from it on a number of programmes aired by the BBC. So I looked at 3 episodes of 3 programmes, that is to say on the Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday of the week following the Paris attacks, as that debate unfolded and took shape. And they were the morning Agenda Setting Today programme on BBC Radio 4, the 6 o'clock news on BBC One, which has the highest television news audience in the UK, and the late night discussion programme Newsnight. And between them, on those 3 days, the 3 programmes put out 12 hours and 45 minutes of broadcasting. 12 hours and 45 minutes. So how much of that time do you think was allocated to what I have termed the blowback thesis as voiced by Jeremy Corbyn? 1 hour? Half an hour? No. Quarter of an hour? No. 5 minutes? No. 1 hour and 3 seconds. Sorry, 1 minute and 3 seconds. Spoiled the effect there. 1 minute and 3 seconds out of 12 hours and 45 minutes. And quite a lot of that, 43 seconds, was accounted for by the single instance on which Jeremy Corbyn's own words on the subject were broadcast, the ones I've just read out. So the effect of this was to make it appear as though Jeremy Corbyn was a kind of isolated figure on the fringe of the debate, completely unsupported by anyone else or any other evidence. Is this actually true? Is this actually a fair and representative presentation of the situation? Well, not entirely, not entirely. Let's just ratchet back in this for a minute and remind ourselves of what it is the BBC is supposed to be doing. As I say, I'm concentrating on the BBC. It is, after all, public broadcasting being done with public money, so it could be thought to be the issue of main public concern. And its journalism is governed by obligations set out in its editorial guidelines, which are translations into journalese of the provisions of its Royal Charter. So one of them says, we are committed to reflecting a wide range of opinion across our output as a whole and over an appropriate time frame, so that no significant strand of thought is knowingly unreflected or underrepresented. Okay? It is also committed to accuracy, and it says that all BBC output must be well sourced based on sound evidence, thoroughly tested and presented in clear, precise language. The BBC must not knowingly and materially mislead its audiences. We should not distort known facts, present invented material as fact, or otherwise undermine our audience's trust in our content. So, what are the reference points that we could use to determine whether Jeremy Corbyn's view was significant? What would make it a significant view? And therefore inform us as to whether it was being properly reflected or underrepresented. Well, one recourse perhaps could be to specialist literature. So in a parallel content analysis, I also looked up something called the ProQuest Worldwide Political Science Abstracts. And that gathers together the abstracts, or the kind of introductory paragraphs, of scholarly papers presented and accepted by refereed academic journals over a 2-year period, nearly 2-year period, from the beginning of 2014 to the time of the Paris attacks, the middle of November 2015, in which the combination of words Islamic State cropped up. Now, of, I think, about 370 results, a few were not relevant because the phrase Islamic State cropped up in another context. Perhaps it was something about the agricultural policy of the Islamic State of Iran, for example, or something like that. But about 270 were relevant, and of those 270 odd, none of them sought to take issue with the proposition that Jeremy Corbyn had put forward in his intervention in the Commons debate, the essence of the blowback thesis, namely that Islamic State took root and grew in the scorched earth left behind when Britain and other allied countries joined in the defenestration of the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq, and is therefore one of its unintended consequences. None of them took issue with it. The vast majority of them iterated that case, that is to say, they put it forwards. So I've compared the situation with the famous scene from the Oscar-winning documentary by Al Gore, An Inconvenient Truth, in which you may recall he notes that, again, comparing the output of relevant specialist scholarly literature with media reports, in this case about human-induced climate change, that over the previous 10 years, the 900-odd scholarly papers in the study which dealt with climate change all agreed that human activity contributed to it. Whereas in newspaper reports over the same period, about 50% were still treating that as a matter of debate. That is to say, not a fact, but a perspective demanding to be balanced by an equal and opposite perspective on the other side. Now, that is the situation which, for example, the One Nation Party would love to have here in Australia in their pressure for ABC journalism to adopt the requirement to be, in their terms, fair and balanced. No, what we need is for public service journalism by a public broadcaster to make it clear that Brian Cox is right and Malcolm Roberts is wrong. So Jeremy Corbyn, I think, therefore, has good reason to feel hard done by in terms of this coverage. I've since done other research on other incidents, such as, for example, the attack on the Parsons Green, the tube train at Parsons Green in West London, which took place in September of last year, when instead of detonating, the explosives actually caused just a massive inferno. And now a court case has been gone, and the perpetrator has been convicted of several counts of attempted murder. But equally there, even though the antecedents of the attack were very clear, even though the two men arrested were a young Iraqi and a young Syrian, even though there were abundant claims of responsibility from Islamic State, there was still no connection made in any of the BBC coverage. And this despite the fact that one of the few prominent commentators in the UK who regularly draws attention to these connections is Professor Paul Rogers from the Department of Peace Studies at Bradford University. And if I could just find what he wrote at the time, he said at the time of the Parsons Green attack, he pointed out that I can't find it, but he pointed out that it came after a particularly intense period of US-led bombing of Islamic State positions in Iraq and Syria, in which many hundreds of people were being killed. So the picture that emerges then is that in spite of its obligations to impartiality and accuracy, BBC journalism in the UK is being in dereliction of its duty, in particular with its treatment or otherwise, in fact, actually virtually ignores this very important blowback thesis, which is well attested. It's held by a majority of specialist scholarly opinion. As Corbyn pointed out, it's also harboured by many of the senior professionals who work in Britain's security and intelligence services, even though they, by the nature of their work, very seldom get a chance to air those views in public. It is nonetheless entirely marginalised, so Jeremy Corbyn appears like an occupant of the lunatic fringe on this issue, when his views are, in fact, in tune with those of a large number of people in Britain and a large cross-section of specialist opinion. Now, what can be done about that? Well, of course, Jeremy Corbyn's shock troops are the Momentum movement, the young activists who've now attained legendary status, even now probably pounding the pavements of Britain, trying to get out the Labour vote in the local elections being held this week. And of course, they are chiefly preoccupied not with mainstream media, but with social media. And social media activism is a large part of their armoury. But my findings suggest that they could very well profit by turning their attention to these deficiencies in BBC coverage when measured against the public service obligations, and if a little bit of pressure was exerted, then from my time at the BBC, I think the preemptive buckle may acquire a different direction and a different dimension, and that could go some way at least towards remedying the situation where the British public is being served up an entirely misleading picture of these issues and Jeremy Corbyn's position on them.